I welcome you to the 83rd sequel of the Church of Uganda at 150 years, a celebration of our church and the state. In today's sequel, we will relook at the burial of Mwanga II in 1910 at Kasubi, and the eruption of Buganda Kingdom against Bishop Taka. Poor man goes into hiding, and he realizes that there is nothing much he can do but to flee the country. Why was this kept a secret? Why is this not reported anywhere? Why is it that this eruption of the country against the bishop was buried by the missionaries in all their writings? Welcome to sequel number 83. I'm the author, Christopher Amos Chikomeko Ntambi. On the 3rd of August 1910, the Namirembe Mission Cathedral Church hosted the state funeral service of the fallen Ssekabaka Mwanga II of Buganda, and the service was led by Bishop Alfred Taka, and he was assisted by his chaplain, the Reverend Ernest Miller, and the native priests, Batulumayo Zimbe and Duta Kitakule. The rest of the native clergy were nowhere to be seen. I repeat, the rest of the native clergy were nowhere to be seen. The cathedral had the chaplain, the cathedral had Duta Kitakule, and the cathedral had Batulumayo Zimbe, but not any other native priests. The missionary priests were present, but earlier on, the Archdeacon Herbert Walker, the Venerable Herbert Walker, had left for England for his own wedding. He was marrying a lady called Eleanor Barber, and so that wedding was to happen in September. So he had left a little bit earlier, and these events did not find him in Buganda. At the funeral service at Namirembe, the acting governor, Joe Miller, was present. Remember, Hesketh Bell had retired the previous year, and the British government had not yet appointed a replacement by 1910. And I remember telling you in an earlier sequel that Apollo Kagwa and his colleagues decided to use this political vacuum, because there was a vacuum in Buganda and there was also a vacuum in England because the government was changing, and it was actually the new government, the Prime Minister and the Colonial Secretary, who were new, who gave the go-ahead for the exhumation of Mwanga and the burial. So at the state funeral, the acting governor was called Joe Miller. He was very present. Katikiro Apollo Kagwa, the regent, was very present. But missing at the cathedral was Stanlas Mugwanya. He was not there. Apparently, he had already left with the advance party to Kasubi. Zakaria Kizito Kisingiri was present. He was also a regent. And those were the senior government officials, both the Protectorate and the Buganda government, at the service. The service was completely boycotted by the Rubaga mission missionaries, who had already left to Kasubi. The Rubaga mission had told all Roman Catholics not to go to Namirembe, but to go straight to Kasubi. And these Roman Catholic white fathers and the bishops, their bishop, were already at Kasubi and waiting there for the arrival of the body. So there were Bishop Henry Stranger and his other priests, the white fathers, and also the Mill Hill missionary, Bishop Henry bishop, their own bishop, I think he was called Hanlon, were all already at Kasubi, and they were waiting there. Now, at the service, the remains were said to be in a much smaller coffin compared to the box in which they had arrived at the Kisingiri residence at Mengo. And therefore, because it was a smaller coffin, it had been put on a carriage which was being pulled by men. And pall bearers were the ones pulling it, alongside it, and also in front of it. So it arrived at Namirembe, and they were able to put the smaller coffin inside the cathedral. The officials who had been invited included dignitaries from the other states of the protectorate. But it is notable to note that majority of the kings did not come in person, but they sent representatives and their premiers. And so Ankole was represented, Bunyoro was represented, Busoga was represented, Karagwe, northern Tanzania, was represented, Mumias, the Mumias in Mwanga in western Kenya, were also represented. So those were the most senior foreign dignitaries at the funeral of Mwanga at Namirembe. The security was very tight. Not only was it maintained by the police, but it was also maintained by the King African Rifles. They were all over the place. Mengo was fully covered by those soldiers, fully armed to the teeth. They were worried about trouble by the Abataka. They were worried about trouble by the Roman Catholics. And so they were very alert and ready to confront anybody disturbing. But fortunately, as you will hear, there wasn't much disturbance apart from verbal attacks. Why the verbal attacks? The sermon was given by the bishop, Alfred Tucker. And during the sermon, he said things that did not please those who were listening. And I will quote. For example, he said that the tradition of the Kabakas being buried inside a palace and their tombs becoming a shrine maintained by the female descendants of the late Kabaka's wives, who then practically lived in the tomb palace and performed the rituals from time to time to appease the spirit mediums of the fallen Kabaka, was wrong and had to stop. Now, at that particular moment, there was murmuring amongst the natives' male side. Now, I want to explain something here. In the cathedral, the men sat on one side and the women sat on one side. But in this, for this particular service, the congregation, there were more of men than women. So on both sides there were men, but in a certain portion, women were arranged to sit in a particular smaller section. So there was no noise coming from the women, but on the male side, there were murmurs. When the bishop preaching in Uganda was saying that it was wrong for the mausoleums or the tombs of the kings to be turned into shrines and for women to live there practically for almost the rest of their lives, because even when they grew old, those women were replaced by their descendants, and that this spirit which they appeased and called and worshipped was wrong, because as Christians that had to stop, and therefore the men began murmuring on one side. But that did not stop the bishop. The bishop continued on, and I'll quote him. He was saying that by turning the Kabaka's tombs into shrines that in itself was satanic. Again, the men murmured, and this time they even became louder. And so what Bishop Tucker did was to stop speaking in Luganda, and the rest of the sermon was given in English. So definitely they couldn't understand, but at least the senior officials from the protectorate government and the missionaries could now follow, and therefore the sermon went on uninterrupted after the initial interruption by the native Africans when the bishop attacked the norms that were followed for the royal funeral. Now, after the service, outside, Bishop Tucker was verbally attacked. People were throwing bad words at him and cursing him and telling him how he will not survive in Buganda anymore. And remember, Bishop Tucker could hear the language. He could speak Luganda. He could hear Luganda very well. So these words disturbed him so much that he asked his chaplain to proceed on to Kasubi, that despite the heavy security, he did not feel comfortable to go to Kasubi because he didn't know what might happen there, despite the fact that the security was very tight. Now, the men who were pulling the carriage on which the body of Mwanga was and the pallbearers began to move in a very dignified way with invited dignitaries. And all those dignitaries were to walk behind the carriage-pulled carriage with the body. And that was a distance of about 2 miles from Namirembe to Kasubi Hill. Actually, when you are on Namirembe, you could even see where they were going. And all the place was full of thousands and thousands of people along the roads, watching the people who were moving, or the dignitaries who were moving with the royal carriage on which the body was. And the soldiers were practically everywhere, fully armed, ready to confront anybody and anyone who caused problems. Now, despite all that, one could see the tension. The tension was very high. That's why the place was surrounded by people who are armed. At Kasubi, the Roman Catholic clergy who were there in big numbers, led by their own Bishop Henry Stracher, took over the initial burial prayers, complete with Latin liturgical responses. Now, this surprised people, but remember, the bishop was not there, and perhaps he was the only one who could confront them. So, without anybody confronting them, they continued leading burial prayers, complete with their Latin liturgy responses. So, Bishop Henry, in his prayers, condemned what had happened. He said that it was very wrong to think that the funeral service could only be held at Namirembe Cathedral. And he insisted that that idea of Westminster Abbey, which the British had reasoned as the answer, was wrong, and that it was not right. He was saying that the equivalence of Westminster Abbey in the Buganda context did not exist. And he said it was wrong not to respect the shrine, the tomb shrine cultures of the Baganda. And then he also said that by them coming to Kasubi, they had not disobeyed the British authorities, but they had to do what they did because they had evidence that Mwanga was more of a Roman Catholic than he was an Anglican. So Stracher was able to say all these things, and he was cheered all along as he spoke. Finally, he gave back the opportunity to the Anglican clergy to continue with the burial prayers. And that is when the Reverend Ernest Miller took over, assisted by Reverend Henry Duta Chitakule and Reverend Batulumayo Musoke Zimbe. Other priests were around, but they were not robed. Anglican priests, but they were not robed, so you could not really identify them easily as priests, but they attended, but they didn't want to be identified. Now, Bishop Tucker, after the burial, was again attacked, this time by Bishop Henry Stretcher of the White Fathers, whose headquarters was at both Kavirondo and at Villa Maria. He went to Bishop Tucker and he accused him of taking over a Roman Catholic royal service with the help of the protectorate officers. Apparently, he told him that he was aware that the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, had ordered his colonial secretary, Robert Crowe Mihes, to send a telegram to Kampala ordering a quick burial to avoid the population becoming excited. So the bishop was accusing the British of frustrating the people by not allowing them to behave in the African way of grieving for their king for a number of days, but given 24 hours in which to bury. And Stretcher was saying that they had come to get all these details, and they now know how Britain had taken over the entire burial process. He was also saying, Bishop Stretcher, that he was aware how London had ordered for the Namirembe Cathedral service funeral when they, even at Lubaga, had already arranged for one. Now, Mwanga II was buried in the normal way. The cutting off of the jaw was not allowed. So the entire body, including the head, were buried. This was despite protests from the elders and even the Namasole Bagalayaze, who wanted him to be buried in the normal way, to bury the body separately from the jaw. Now, as if that was not enough, the traditionalists who had even accused and abused the bishop were continually baying for the bishop's blood. They did not know that the bishop had not come to Kasubi. So for them, they continued baying for his blood, saying they will kill him, they will kill him. Why did he refuse a burial at Mengo? That if he didn't want Mengo, they should have allowed at least a burial at Munyonyo. So all these were things that the elders kept on saying, even as the burial was going on. So that's why Bishop Tucker was not there. I think he was right. He knew that things will not be very well. And so now that the bishop then instead, even after the funeral, was attacking him, was looking for him and saying all those terrible things, made Bishop Tucker realize that he was in problems. He was in problems as a bishop. So the burial at Kasubi ended up into a fight between traditionalists under the church, under the state. That is what the kind of conclusion I can give it. Bishop Tucker became a real person to attack. He had death threats, he had attack threats, and he could only be protected by the British protectorate officers, which was very sad, but that is what happened. Anyway, it has been said that because of those insults, the bishop was disappointed that the native clergy had not come to his rescue. That in fact he was amazed that they were with the natives when it came to the burial rituals. That the native clergy of Buganda were more sympathetic to the Buganda cultural norms, such as the royal burial sport, than to allow the Baganda to be delivered from such bondage. That was the bishop's position. And that disappointment with his clergy was very, very evident. Now, these curses and death threats on the bishop because of a dead Kabaka who had even died close to a decade earlier was very, very disturbing to Bishop Tucker. And in that situation, he felt he was uncomfortable. He needed to go somewhere and rest. Therefore, after he hid from everybody, and people wondering, where is the bishop? Where is the bishop? But the bishop was busy packing. He was busy packing, and after he had packed, he found no use telling the native clergy, apart from the very few. The archdeacon was not there, he was in England. And therefore, after packing, after bidding farewell to a few people who he asked to keep it a secret, he needed to go away. The Bishop Alfred Tucker, fled the country. He was not bid farewell. Nobody went to see him off at Luzira or wherever he left from, because nobody knows even how he left. It was a secret. He was an expert at wearing in a very casual way. So maybe even those who saw him thought he was a protectorate officer. Although he was really a household person, everybody knew him and how he looked. But that's how he escaped. This did not happen immediately. A few weeks passed in order for him to study the atmosphere, but he was hiding from everybody. He was not attending services. He did not bid farewell to anybody. The rumor said that he went to the palace, but even the Kabaka was not told the truth. It was as if it was a normal visit. Yet he was basically saying goodbye to the Kabaka, because then he was a Kabaka. As we are going to see, a few days earlier, the Kabaka, and that was on the much earlier, on the 8th, because this funeral was happening on the 3rd. But on the 8th, there was a kind of a British style installation of the Kabaka. The Kabaka was installed in a traditional way. Not even on the 8th. The following day, immediately after the funeral, as the Kabaka went into hiding on the 4th of August 1910, outside the Mengo Palace gate, Chua II adorned a dry lion skin, a dry leopard skin, several terracotta back clothes, and he held a copper-headed spear and a shield. He then sounded the 400-year-old Mujaguzo drum, and which was covered with a dry python skin. Python is the snake. And he took an oath of office under the British law. So the oath he took was under the British law. However, he was told that he had no executive power because the 3 regents were still the one with executive power until 4 years later, when he would have become 18 years. So on his 18th birthday, the British promised him that that's when they would recognize him of age and therefore take on executive power. However, the elders told the British that there was a more traditional ceremony of him now, after becoming the Kabaka, to conquer the kingdom. And that conquering of the kingdom, the ceremonies had to take place on a hill called the Budo. But the British told them that that would be allowed, but not immediately. It would be allowed when the king becomes 18th, so that when he conquers, he then also takes executive power of the kingdom. So he was not allowed to go to Budo to conquer the kingdom. The Budo ceremony was not held in 1910. It was promised to be held in the future. The British insisted that until he was 18, they would not recognize his power as such, as much as they recognized him as the Kabaka. So now it became vice versa. To the Baganda is a full Kabaka because he has acted that act of accession, but now for the British, is not yet with power until he became 18. The things became vice versa. But anyway, that is our 83rd sequel, Mwanga is buried. Bishop Tucker is preparing to flee the country in a history that has been buried, that has not been written about in books. Yet, newspaper stories at Makerere, you could see somebody intentionally pulling out the sections of the newspaper which had those reports. Thank God, some of these were photocopied and put on microfilms, and I have been able to find the story and put it together for you. And now we know. So whoever tried to destroy this history, especially missionaries, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Whatever you heed, 150 years later, or is it only 120, is now public knowledge. May the good Lord bless us all.